Have you ever had an alarming feeling that something's happened to someone close to you, a family member or romantic partner, and then later finding that something did happen, like an accident or at least something that caused that person some sharp anxiety? It's not that common, but if you have, you're not alone. When researchers do surveys, a lot of people come forward with stories of this kind. We call it telepathy, but we can't be sure about it because science tells us it's impossible. There's no way that the biological brain can communicate like that. Yet cases like this often do defy easy explanation. And in fact, there is another way to think about this that makes sense if we're able to accept it, and that's what I want to explore in this video. Are such things really so impossible in nature? Or do we just need to look at nature with fresh eyes? Hello, my name's Robert. I'm a journalist and author, and on this channel I talk about these sorts of anomalous experiences, things that seem to happen that really shouldn't happen, and that cause a lot of controversy. It isn't well known, but a lot of scientific research has been done in this area, and recently I've been helping to create a free online encyclopedia about it. If you'd like to learn more, I'll leave a link in the description below. And by the way, if you find this information helpful, please do click like and subscribe. It really helps. I can quite see why so many people are skeptical, because nothing in our current understanding of physics tells us how thoughts or feelings could travel directly from one mind to another, especially across large distances. So why are these sorts of interactions reported so often? Are we perhaps missing something? Is there some subtle form of energy that physics hasn't discovered yet? If so, does it have to do with electromagnetic signals or perhaps biophotons, tiny emissions of light from the brain? Not really, because no one's ever detected anything like that. And even if they had, how would it explain cases where the two people seem to be in telepathic contact when they're hundreds or even thousands of miles apart? Because that absolutely happens. Two people separated in different countries, even different continents. New York and London, Tokyo, Toronto. And it gets even more weird. How does one brain find another specific brain among all the other millions of brains all around? You see the problem? That's why the objections are so forceful. There's no way for a brain in one place to reach out and communicate with a brain somewhere else. Okay, I think that's where we get stuck, thinking about brains when perhaps we should be thinking about minds, as actually most of us do. Most of us think the mind is an actual thing, like part of our anatomy. If a friend suggests that we do something together tonight, we might say, "What have you got in mind?" Not, "What thought have you got in your brain?" We don't think about our thoughts as actual physical things. Of course we don't. But most scientists, physicists, psychologists, neuroscientists absolutely do, at least in a professional context. For them, thoughts are what happens because of the activity going on in the grey matter in our skulls. It's purely biological. They don't think thoughts are created by an independent mind, because what could that possibly be? Thing is, though, explaining how the brain does this is really hard. In fact, when consciousness researchers discuss these things, they literally talk about it as the hard problem. That's what they call it. And it bothers a lot of the people who think deeply about this. People who, by the way, are absolutely committed to the scientific view of the brain as the source of consciousness. Of course, it's true that neuroscientists can now get extraordinarily detailed information about what's happening inside the brain. With scanning technology, they can figure out what specific regions correlate to various kinds of mental experience. They can see neurons activating, networks cohering. But nowhere in all of that do they see consciousness itself. You can speculate, but no one knows how electrical and chemical activity becomes the experience of seeing color or feeling pain or having a thought. Now, this isn't always obvious. The impression you'll get in the media is that neuroscience is steadily advancing, that we're gradually solving the mystery of consciousness. And it can seem like an exaggeration, as quite a few people in this space are willing to admit. They might compare the quest to understand the origins of consciousness to an expedition to climb Everest, and they say, look, we haven't yet reached base camp. But even that implies progress, and I think it still understates the problem. It would be more true to say that if the expedition is setting out from London or New York or Tokyo or wherever, then we're still stuck in traffic on the way to the airport. Because when you look closely, the gap is enormous. That's why some scientists and philosophers who talk about these things wonder whether it's possible, even in principle, to explain consciousness. And for some of them, the way out is to play down the whole idea of consciousness, to think of it as an illusion, or even that the very idea of it is misconceived, that there's no such thing, that it doesn't exist. Some go so far as to claim that we humans are literally deluded to think that we're conscious. Which actually, if you think about it, is exactly what many people say about claims of telepathy and other types of psychic experience. So here's a solution. It's simply to accept that there is such a thing as mind or consciousness or whatever you want to call it, not the outcome of physical processes, but something that actually exists in nature in its own right, something that's given, that's part of the world we inhabit. And that involves a big shift. At its heart, science is mechanistic. It sees things working in conjunction with other things. The smallest building blocks of matter, the quarks and protons, gravity, electromagnetism, and the nuclear forces. And that applies to our bodies too, on a larger scale. The liver produces bile. The pancreas produces insulin. The stomach produces digestive enzymes. It's all about producing, leading to effects. Everything has a function, is part of a process. So from that perspective, why shouldn't the brain produce consciousness in exactly the same way? But what if that expectation is the problem? What if we're trying to force something into a framework where it doesn't belong? Perhaps we've got this the wrong way round, that it's not the brain that produces consciousness, but rather that consciousness produces the brain, along with literally everything else. The idea here is that the fundamental thing in the universe isn't matter, physical stuff, it's consciousness itself. In the philosophy of mind, this has a name. It's called idealism. It suggests that everything we experience, the physical world included, arises from consciousness. If we make this shift, something interesting happens. The picture changes. Instead of a universe made up of dead particles, we have something more like a universe made of mind, a kind of vast underlying awareness, a sort of great mind, if you like. And in that case, our individual minds aren't separate things, sealed off from each other. They're local expressions of that larger whole from which they originate and to which they're still connected. This idea goes back millennia. It's the basis of the great spirituality traditions that emphasize the interconnectedness of all nature, non-local in current terminology, meaning not locally produced in the brain. It's the common insight of people who've had a near-death experience or a powerful vision simulated by psilocybin or mescaline or ayahuasca. We are in some sense all part of a single field of consciousness, billions of individual waves in the one single ocean, possessing a kind of individuality, to be sure, but never truly separate from the whole. Now think about telepathy in that context. One of the striking things about it is that it often occurs between people who are emotionally close, parents and children, twins, partners in a relationship. In a purely physical world, distance should matter, but not here. What matters is connection. However far apart two people may be geographically, they may be right next to each other in this underlying field. So what looks like communication across space may not involve crossing space at all. It may simply be a kind of resonance within a shared system. This does sound strange, but that in itself shouldn't be a problem. So does modern physics. At the quantum level, the world behaves in ways that defy common sense. We know now that atoms, the stuff that make up things that seem solid, are in fact mostly empty space. And there's a feature which seems particularly suggestive in relation to telepathy. It's called entanglement, where two particles can be linked in such a way that a change in one is reflected in the other, no matter how far apart they are. Not because something travels between them, but because at some deeper level, they're not actually separate. Okay, what's true for tiny particles doesn't automatically apply to complex biological organisms like human brains. But if the principle exists in one aspect of nature, who's to say it doesn't exist in others? There's a story that helps illustrate how limited perspective can be. It's a short novel that was published in the 1880s called Flatland, and it describes a two-dimensional world inhabited by flat beings in the form of two-dimensional geometric shapes, lines, circles, squares, who can't perceive the third dimension. They've no idea that such a thing exists, and this limits their perception of events. If a three-dimensional object passes through their world, they see only strange shapes that make no sense to them. They don't see the whole. Now, in a world like that, you might see mysterious circles appearing and disappearing in sequence, and not understand that you've been visited by an elephant. And the point isn't necessarily that there are hidden spatial dimensions, though there may be. It's a metaphor to show how our perspective may be limited in ways we don't realize. If that's the case, then phenomena that seem impossible from our current viewpoint may not be impossible at all. So perhaps it's worth trying, just as a thought experiment, to look at things differently. In a quiet moment, look around you. The walls, the furniture, whatever happens to be in front of you. Imagine them not as solid objects, but as patterns of activity, tiny particles, mostly empty space, held together by forces we don't directly perceive. Now take it a step further. Imagine that all of this, everything you see, is part of a kind of vast thought, not a machine, more like a dream. And you're not just in it, you are part of it. Your mind, your ability to think, reflect, plan, and imagine is essentially the same thing that causes the outside world to exist. Like a wave in an ocean, with a certain individuality and infinitesimally small in relation to the whole, but part of the whole. This isn't about drifting off into fantasy, it's about stretching the way we think. As we know, physics has already forced us to do this, with ideas that seem absurd but which have been empirically established. So perhaps we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss other possibilities. If the universe is, at its deepest level, something like a thought, something grounded in consciousness, then our own minds may share its nature. And in that case, when something affects us deeply, when there is strong emotion, strong connection, it may create effects that are not confined to the physical, not signals traveling through space, but ripples in a shared medium. That might help explain why in very rare cases someone can intuitively feel that something has happened to a loved one at the exact same moment, why someone might perceive an event at a distance, why in extreme situations people might report experiences of being outside their bodies, of seeing themselves from a different perspective, why certain kinds of phenomena, even more controversial than telepathy, ghosts and apparitions of dead people, for example, are reported again and again, often linked to strong emotion or trauma. It might even justify the belief that consciousness doesn't simply disappear when the body dies, that in some way we survive death. In this way of thinking, these aren't miracles or violations of nature, they're expressions of a deeper level of it. Of course, all of this depends on whether such experiences are real. And if you're convinced they aren't, then there's no need to rethink anything. The current scientific framework is enough. And there are understandable concerns here. Ideas like this can seem to open the door to superstition or to religious belief in forms that many people are uncomfortable with. But we don't have to go there. We can simply ask, what kind of universe would make sense of the experiences people actually report? If the world we inhabit is at its deepest level something like a thought, something arising from consciousness, then connections that seem impossible in purely physical terms may not be impossible at all. Very occasionally, something from that deeper level seems to break through. And I think it's also important to stress, since I know some people worry about it, that acknowledging all this doesn't in the least change our daily experience. The physical world remains real. It behaves consistently. It's what we live in. Telepathic interactions seem mostly to be fleeting, spontaneous. All the research confirms that. The fact that it sometimes happens doesn't mean our minds are open for anyone to read. Of course not. So we don't have to be scared of it. We could just simply follow where it leads, to an idea of the world that right now, in the 2020s, seems bizarre, but that one day, who knows, even within decades, may come to seem normal, acknowledged by science. And for me, that's what's so significant about telepathic experiences. It's that they tell us insistently, if we're able to accept them, that the current scientific consensus about consciousness as a biological mechanism most probably does not correspond with the reality. If you'd like to know more about telepathy, I've made a video which describes the arguments both for and against, and I've also made one on case studies of telepathy in children. Links in the description below, and I hope I'll see you there.